Hello, my name's Ted Leavitt, and I'm a lead technical support analyst with the BMC Control M support team here in the Americas. I'll be leading an overview with you regarding the new managed file transfer for Control M. Before we look at today's agenda, I'd like to introduce to you today's panelists, James Pendergrast and Richard Talbert. Today, what we're going to be discussing are first the prerequisites regarding the installation of the managed file transfer, the benefits we have of the MFT, particularly over the advanced file transfer or AFT. I'm going to discuss upgrading from AFT, demonstrate for you the use and configuration of the MFT, and then provide you some useful information like some related knowledge articles and webinars and some other information, and then wrap up with a question and answer session where we'll answer any questions you might have. And please do address any questions you have in the Q&A panel to all panelists. So first, regarding the prerequisites, we require a certain level of the Control M to install the managed file transfer. Your enterprise manager must be at version 9, FixPack 3 or higher, the server at version 9, FixPack 2 or higher, and the Control M agent at version 8 with 64 bits installed if you're on a Windows or Linux machine. In order for the clients to be able to download the MFT, they have to have access to the Enterprise Manager web server. So this is also a prerequisite. We need to make sure that the clients have access to the web server in addition to everything else. So in terms of the benefits of the MFT, we have a few things. First, we have a new dashboard to show the MFT activity. We'll get into this more later, and I'll demonstrate this. We have increased both the FTP and SFTP client performance with some tuning, and we're using now new libraries as compared to the advanced file transfer, and we've been able to achieve some significant throughput improvements. We allow you to save the information that we've accumulated regarding the file transfers with MFT, and you can save those out to a file for analysis offline. And then we provide a file transfer server, which is going to be an FTP server or FTP with SSL, and an SFTP server. This is going to be available on certain platforms. We'll review that a little later. And then lastly, the file transfers are going to be viewable in the new self-service interface. In terms of upgrading from AFT, there are a few things. First and foremost, when we're installing the MFT, we're installing it initially only on the Enterprise Manager, and I'll show you the installation screens for this shortly. The MFT is deployed to the agents via the CCM, very similar to how the agent deployment works. We had a webinar on this earlier. I'll link to that later in the presentation, but I'll also demonstrate the deployment to an agent during our demonstration. When the upgrade is performed, we take the accounts.dat file from the AFT and we transform it to an accounts.xml file. It has the same content, but it looks slightly different. In terms of security, we're using a few different forms here. We have a Java key store for the FTPS server, and we're using a PKCS 12 file for the FTPS client. Now, another thing we've done is for the SFTP client, when you're connecting to an SFTP server, we've taken the key pairs or the public keys specifically and translated them from a PuTTY key or PPK to an OpenSSH DES key. So you'll see in the advanced properties of your SFTP connections that the key has changed and that PPK extension has been removed because we've essentially transformed the key or converted the key, and it's in this new format. Lastly, there have been some changes to some job messages. We've tried to keep things as similar as to how they've been before, but just keep in mind that if you have very specific on-do statements for your AFT jobs, you will want to ensure that these match. So to the dashboard itself, this dashboard is a new feature and is one of the driving factors to get to the managed file transfer. What it is, and I'll show you later in the demonstration, it's a part of the monitoring domain in the workload automation GUI, which will present to you an overview of the current and historical file transfers. And it's also searchable by a variety of different values, and we'll go over the searches later. By default, we store 30 days and 7 million records worth of historical data, but there's a caching mechanism in place which helps ensure that our searches are performed quickly. And the information that you'll see in the history relates to both the job and the transfer details, and it'll include things like the file sizes, the transfer rates, and other information. And we'll see a demonstration of what that looks like later. In the dashboard, there are widgets or clickable items for things like the hosts involved in the transfer, the status of the transfer, okay and not okay, and you can click on the different portions of these, the individual widgets, and they'll zoom in to that specific data. Now, our intent on using this architecture is to expand on it, and we are going to be creating new objects based on the feedback from you, our customers. So this is something that's going to grow, and we would like to hear back from you on that. In regards to the file transfer server, which we also call the FTS, this is available on Linux and Windows agents, and since Windows doesn't have an out-of-the-box FTP or SFTP server, and you'll generally need to install the IIS or Internet Information Server to get an FTP server, this allows you that functionality without having to install IIS on your Windows machine, and it allows you as the Control M administrator to manage these file transfer servers. Similarly, on the Linux system, as the Control M administrator, you can manage the file transfer server without needing to involve the system administrator. They're not enabled by default, but we're going to walk through and I'll demonstrate how we can enable these. It's a pretty simple process, and we'll go through that. Lastly, the file transfer server is able to use either OS authentication, PAM on Unix, or Windows authentication in Windows, or you can also set up LDAP authentication. We'll briefly review that in our demonstration as well. In regards to the security improvements, the MFT for both the client and the server now supports TLS 1, 1.1, and 1.2. In previous versions of AFT, it had been a subset of the three depending on which version you were using. We support the SHA-2 signed certificates, which were, of course, mandatory as of January 2016. And this was an enhancement in the AFT8 FixPack 1. And because we've changed the backend, we're using a standard Java package for the SSL. We support a variety of new ciphers and key exchange algorithms. For the SSH, like I talked about before, we're using standard DES keys, and we do also support an additional set of new ciphers and key exchange algorithms. We support the SSH keys from 1024-bit to 4096-bit. And I have a link at the end of the presentation with details on what ciphers, key exchange algorithms, etc. that we do support in the new MFT in case you're interested to get the full list, but I'll also show you that in drop-downs in the demonstration. Next, we had talked about the installation of the MFT and the fact that we only do this on the Enterprise Manager, and I'd like to walk you quickly through the screens. We have a standard Control-M installation here. I'm going to show you the screens on Windows. These are the same screens that you'd see on Unix if you had an X server running, and the console install is going to essentially prompt you with the same items, but you won't have the graphics. Our first screen is our usual license agreement. The second screen essentially checking to see if anything needs to be stopped, which we don't need to do here. Third screen is showing us the destination path. We can see this is the Windows install, and I'm putting it in the default location. I'm going to proceed. We then install the MFT package on the EM server, and this is going to include all of the code for the agents which we're going to be deploying, as well as everything else necessary to send to the clients and everything else. When the file copy completes, we're presented with the final screen here where we're told we need to restart the configuration server on the Enterprise Manager and the configuration manager, the CCM, and the GUI server. And this is to ensure that we update these and refresh them and make them aware that the managed file transfer has been installed. Moving forward, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start the demonstration. I'd like to start first by showing you what the deployment looks like. And this is the Enterprise Manager 9 Configuration Manager. And I'm going to go up here in the Manage tab and click Deployment, and we can see that I've previously deployed both the Agent Fix Pack 2 and Managed File Transfer to a number of different agents. So here I have my MFT installation from something previous, and you can click the logs as is standard with any agent deployment. We can see what's going on here. But what I want to do now is install or deploy Managed File Transfer to another agent. So I'm going to pull down New Activity from the top left, select Managed File Transfer, and then Upgrade or Install. I'm prompted to put the name of the activity and a description, and here I have the opportunity to select a couple of items. Since I want to install the MFT immediately when I'm deploying it, I'm going to select the second option, Transfer and Automatically Install Package. Clicking Next, I'm presented with the list of agents where I'm going to be able to deploy the MFT, and these are agents which are available and don't already have the MFT installed that meet the requisite agent version. So I'm going to select a couple of these hosts and then click Install. And we can see that the deploy action is started and running. And we'll come back to this later. I'm going to close the deployment window. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a file transfer server, FTS, that's already installed. I have one installed here on Windows. Going to select the Manage File Transfer from the left side and right click on it and then select File Transfer Server. And here there are a couple of options that I want to talk about. Most importantly is the home directory. I'm going to go to the end of this line, and two things I want to point out. First is that with the MFT installation, we create a directory called FTS Home under the CM folder in AFT. This is where by default we place the users' home directories, and these are going to be the users that are connecting to the file transfer server, either the SFTP server or the FTP server. You'll see here a variable after FTS home, $bracket username. So the intent of this is to use the username as the user's home directory, and the file transfer server will do what we call a change route into this directory. So when that user connects to the FTS, they only have access to their home directory and directories under it. They will not be able to access any directories above it. For example, the AFT or anything else on the C drive. They'll be set to their user's home directory as the highest level they can go. Each of the other options typically has some help at the bottom, which gives you a brief explanation. You can also take a look in the Control M Administrator Guide for more details on those parameters. I'm going to skip past these for now. They're somewhat self-explanatory, and I'm going to go to the FTP and FTP-S configuration. So I had enabled this server prior, and there are a couple things of note I want to state here. First, an FTP server typically runs on port 21. Anything below port 1024 is what we refer to as a privileged port that typically an application doesn't have access to. What we've done is we have changed the default port for our file transfer servers to be 1221 for FTP and 1222 for SFTP, and we'll see the other port in the other screen. So that's something to keep in mind when we're connecting to the file transfer server or creating a connection profile for it. We'll need to specify the port that's used in the configuration. In terms of the authentication, we see here, since this is a Windows install, we have two options, the Windows Local or LDAP. And we have secured. Secured in this case means that it is going to be SSL secured, and the client will need to negotiate for a connection. So we see here the key store path. This is the Java key store to which I referred earlier. You'll see that in the search directory FTS, meaning File Transfer Server key store, and the key store file password is the key store file pass. This is in the admin guide if you're interested in changing it. And then the cipher list. And like I said, this is much larger than it was previously, and we can see in scrolling down we support a variety of different ciphers now with our file transfer server. These are the same ciphers that are going to be supported by the FTP-S client as well, since it's using the same package as the file transfer server. All right. Let's hop over to the SFTP and look at the configuration here. Again, the port is using 1222, that non-privileged port that's going to be accessible by the Control M agent user. We have a key store file path. Again, this is in the keys, and the key store file password is going to be in the admin guide if you wish to change it. We have the list of ciphers, larger than before, and then we have what we call the known users file path here, which is actually the authorized keys file if you're familiar with SSH. This is where we're going to place those public keys. And then again, the authentication is either through Windows or LDAP. In terms of the LDAP authentication, this is very similar to how the Enterprise Manager is configured. You'll put in the admin user or search user, that user's password, the URL, and the URL is, instead of in the Enterprise Manager where we have host and port, the URL will be in the form of LDAP://host:/port. The base DN is the LDAP search base that you'll be using. Right? So I'm going to cancel this here. And the next thing I want to do is create a connection profile in my managed file transfer. And you'll see that this is looking very similar to the AFT. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add an endpoint, and I have to name my connection profile. I'm selecting a single endpoint. This was a feature that was introduced in AFT 8 where you could have single endpoints. It allows your jobs to be more flexible instead of using the old double endpoint connection profile. And since I only have one user defined here, we can assume I'm using LDAP authentication. What I'm going to do is click Add Manually, and this will allow me to enter free text for a user or group. For testing purposes, I'm just going to put an asterisk in the user field, and this will allow me to access this connection profile with any user in the Workload Automation GUI. So next, I'm presented with the host details, and I only have one host since it's a single endpoint. First thing I'm going to do is connect to the machine with SFTP. I'm going to put in my host, monkey, my username, root, and my password. I'm going to click the Get Home Directory button, and what this is going to do is this will do an initial connection to that host and retrieve the home directory. It's a pretty good test in terms of verifying connectivity, and this should come back to me shortly, and we'll see here that we came back with a slash. Now we have the next set, the additional parameters. I'm just going to leave these default, but you can uncheck these or check these depending on your needs. And then for time's sake, I'm not going to click the test button. I'm just going to click Finish. We know we have connectivity because we did the Get Home Directory test. Okay, so we can see that we've added a connection profile, and that was successful. So next, I'm going to pop over to my Control-M, a Workload Automation GUI, and I'm going to create a new job. I'm going to open a blank workspace, and I'm going to drag down the file transfer into my workspace here, and I'm going to first rename the folder because I don't want something called folder 2 floating around. I'm going to change this from order method automatic to manual because I don't want my test job ordering every day for me. I'm going to rename my job demo job, and the next most important thing here is my host or host group. You would specify the name of the agent where you have the managed file transfer installed. I'm going to leave it blank because I'm going to use the same agent as my Control-M server, in this case, CWCM Schedule. So the next thing I'm going to do, since I've selected my host by essentially not putting it in there, I'm going to click on the ellipses by the connection profile, and I'm going to select two connection profiles that I had previously defined on this host. I'm going to pick Lemming, and this is a connection to the host's SFTP, and then I'm going to pick CWCM Local. So with the managed file transfer, similar to the advanced file transfer, we have the ability to use what we call local CM, which will bypass connection to any sort of file transfer server and directly through the agent place a file on the agent's local system. So that's what we're going to do in this case. And I am going to transfer a file, var log secure, because I like having the logs for my Unix systems dumped down to somewhere else so I can look at them. And what I'm going to do now is order our job, and this will synchronize the folder and upload the job, and we'll be able to see it now in the monitoring domain. And in the monitoring domain, we have, that just quickly went, we have our demo job here under no application, no sub application, because I left those fields blank, and we can take a look in the synopsis pane on the right. I'll do an output, and here we can see our file transferred. But the most important part we're talking about here is managed file transfer. In the tools ribbon, I'm going to pull down managed file transfer from the top, and we can see our dashboard. We have on the left a list of the different agents that are involved in the file transfer. We can see our CWCM Schedule host, which was that, and some of the other hosts in which I had installed the managed file transfer. We see on the right a widget with our jobs. We have 24 jobs, and we have some failed and completed. And what I can do is I can actually hover over the failed portion of the donut graph and click on it, and we have here our jobs that have failed recently On the right, we can see that the order ID of the job and the job output. Now, these by default are pulling the last 2 days, which is the default criteria for our searches. But clicking the search, we can get more detail on this. And in our new search, we have the advanced button where we can specify a variety of these different fields, both relating to the files that you're transferring as well as the jobs. You see here we have a file name, source and destination machines, source and destination paths, application, sub-application folder relating to the jobs. And one of the nice things I had noticed in testing this as well is in your managed file transfer jobs, you have the option for doing post actions. And when you do something like a move or rename, that's also accounted for here in the search. So if you had moved or renamed a file post transfer, it would be visible or available in the search. So I'm just going to search for a file here, which apparently isn't showing up, but then I'm going to go search for another one that I know I've transferred in the last 2 days. And we can see here, I typed in messages, and when I look for messages, it's showing me both the messages 1 file and the messages file, and we see this is being transferred from a number of different hosts in the last 2 days, again by default, last 48 hours. And I can get information on these file transfers. I'm going to pop back over to the dashboard again, and similarly, I can get on one of these hosts, click on the widget for the bar, and then retrieve the jobs or runs, in this case, for that specific host that have been involved. Okay. One of the things that I want to look at next is the command line utility. We had talked about exporting statistics for analytics and batch. We have this utility called MFT CLI. Makes sense if you say it out slowly. What this is the command line utility on the EM server, which will pull the statistics from the Enterprise Manager database and write these to a file. It takes the username and password, GUI server as arguments, the output file, and then the search criteria. If you run the EM MFT CLI utility from the command line, you'll see some extensive usage syntax, which will have the search criteria, and it gets pretty in-depth. But what I want to do is open up this file that I've created and show you the CSV file. Looks a bit of a mess here, but we can see it contains all of those particular items in the dashboard that we could search on, and some other information regarding those jobs. And you can take this into Excel or another tool and do some analytics based on that. It would be very handy if you need to keep audit records or anything along these lines. So lastly, let's go back to the configuration manager. We had deployed MFT to a couple of agents. I'm going to go back to the deployment and see here that our deploy completed successfully on both our Linux and Windows host. And we can see here the details of that, and like before, we can click log or other things to get information on the deployment. But you can see now that on this host Dragonfly and Lemur, we can open these up. Lemur now has managed file transfer, as does Dragonfly. Okay, so that concludes my demonstration. I'd like to move on to show you some additional information. So we talked about upgrading the AFT to MFT. In that process, the upgrade backs up the files from the AFT, and if you need to recover any of this information, like the accounts.dat file, we have an article that describes where this information can be found. We have a patch for the Enterprise Manager If you encounter a problem where you log into the Enterprise Manager GUI or Configuration Manager and it prompts you for an administrative user and password, this patch addresses that issue. There's the patch and release notes can be found at that link. And lastly, when we had discussed the ciphers, algorithms, and so forth, you can find the list of the supported items at this knowledge article here. We have several webinars that relate to our presentation here. We have about the AFT with SSL, a general AFT presentation, the agent deployment, very similar to the MFT deployment. We have a self-service presentation where we take a look at the MFT, how it shows up there. We have a discussion on client distribution and another presentation on MFT, which is more marketing related you may be interested in reviewing. But I do thank you for taking time out of your day to attend, and I hope what I've shown you is useful. You'll be receiving a survey as you close the webinar, and we would encourage you to fill that out and give us feedback where we can improve and any future topics that you'd like to see. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and our past webinars can be viewed on BMC Community's YouTube and iTunes. Today's webinar will be posted there in a couple of days. Our next webinar for March will be on Control-M named pool variables. Should be an interesting topic. We would also suggest you visit our BMC community site to get connected with other users, view webinars, and post questions and search for answers. BMC communities can be found on the bmc.com homepage or accessed directly at communities.bmc.com.